Have you ever tried to explain something calmly, logically backed by evidence, and watched someone react as if you attacked them personally? Not confused, not curious, offended. That reaction isn't about intelligence, it's about identity. There's a strange experience that happens when you begin thinking more critically. Conversations feel heavier. Social spaces feel tighter. You notice contradictions others ignore. You ask questions that make people uncomfortable. And instead of dialogue, you get resistance. At first you assume you explained it poorly. Then you assume they misunderstood. Eventually, you realize something harder understanding isn't always the goal. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The German theologian executed by the Nazis in 1945 observed something chilling while watching educated Germany collapse into fanaticism. Professors, doctors, engineers. Not ignorant peasants, not uneducated masses, intelligent citizens, and yet they participated in horror. His conclusion was not that they were evil, and not that they were stupid in the conventional sense. He wrote, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice." That line alone changes everything. Because evil can be confronted. Evil leaves tension. It knows it is transgressing. But stupidity, as Bonhoeffer described it, is different. It is immune to argument. It does not respond to evidence. It does not feel guilt. Why? Because it isn't about IQ. It's about surrender. Bonhoeffer observed that under powerful social movements, political, religious, ideological individuals can gradually relinquish their inner independence, not because they lack intelligence, but because belonging feels safer than thinking. And here's the part that still applies today. Stupidity is not a cognitive deficit. It is a psychological trait. Modern neuroscience helps us understand what Bonhoeffer intuited decades ago. Your brain is wired for social survival before intellectual accuracy. Social exclusion historically meant danger. So when a belief becomes fused with group identity, questioning that belief feels like threatening your own survival. Psychologists call this identity fusion. When beliefs are not just ideas, they are extensions of the self. If you challenge the belief, the brain activates threat responses similar to physical danger. This is why logical debates escalate emotionally. You're not debating data. You're destabilizing identity. Bonhoeffer described conversations where one no longer felt they were speaking to a person, but to slogans, catchwords, and the like that had taken possession of him. Today, we would call that cognitive automation. When someone fully internalizes an ideology, their thinking becomes pre-packaged. Pre-approved answers. Pre-installed outrage. The individual's cognitive independence shrinks. It becomes easier to repeat than to reason. But why would anyone surrender independent thought? Because certainty is addictive. The human brain hates ambiguity. Uncertainty increases cortisol, the stress hormone. Ambiguity creates cognitive load. It forces you to hold competing ideas simultaneously. That is uncomfortable. Certainty, even false certainty, reduces stress. It simplifies the world into good and bad, right and wrong, us and them. Bonhoeffer understood this before cognitive science did. He saw that when large movements offer identity, moral clarity, and belonging, many people willingly trade complexity for comfort. And here's what makes this especially dangerous in modern times. Algorithms reward certainty. Social media platforms amplify emotional confidence over intellectual humility. Outrage spreads faster than nuance. Simplified narratives outperform layered analysis. The more absolute the statement, the more engagement it generates, which means the environment itself now incentivizes intellectual surrender. Not because people are dumb, but because surrender is socially profitable. There's another layer Bonhoeffer hinted at that psychology now confirms: motivated reasoning. When information threatens a belief tied to your social identity, the brain doesn't evaluate it neutrally. It searches for flaws. It dismisses contradictions. It deflects. You're not analyzing. You're defending. And the more publicly committed someone is to a belief, the harder it becomes to retreat. Because changing your mind now risks humiliation, loss of tribe, loss of status. So instead of adjusting beliefs, the mind adjusts reality. This explains why facts alone rarely persuade. You assume the barrier is information, but often the barrier is cost. Understanding would require admitting, I was wrong. My group might be flawed. The system I trusted may not be stable. That's existentially destabilizing. So the easier path is intellectual closure. Bonhoeffer called it stupidity. Modern psychology calls it cognitive rigidity. But the mechanism is the same. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The smarter you become, the more friction you experience, not because you're superior, but because you refuse the trade. You refuse to exchange autonomy for certainty. And that makes you socially inconvenient. Independent thinkers don't echo slogans easily. They hesitate before outrage. They ask clarifying questions. They resist emotional contagion. That behavior can feel threatening in environments fueled by collective intensity. Because independence exposes fragility. Bonhoeffer warned that once a person crosses the line into surrendered thinking, persuasion becomes nearly impossible. Not because they lack capacity, but because their autonomy has been outsourced. And when autonomy is outsourced, responsibility is too. History repeatedly shows this pattern. Ordinary individuals participating in destructive systems, not out of sadism, but out of conformity, fused with certainty. The frightening part. None of this requires low intelligence. In fact, highly intelligent individuals can rationalize ideological surrender even more effectively. Intelligence can become a tool for defending a chosen narrative. So the real dividing line is not IQ. It is independence. And independence is costly. It can feel isolating, slower, less rewarded, less validated. But it is also the foundation of wisdom. Bonhoeffer did not survive to see the fall of the regime he resisted, but his insight remains painfully relevant. When people surrender their inner independence, they become instruments of systems larger than themselves. And arguing with an instrument rarely works. The real question is not why others don't understand. The deeper question is this: what keeps you from making the same trade? Because the pull toward certainty, belonging, and emotional safety is universal. The difference is not intelligence. It is whether you tolerate discomfort long enough to think independently. And that discomfort, that tension between clarity and belonging, is the price of freedom. Have you ever walked away from an argument thinking, that was pointless? It's like they weren't even listening. They probably weren't, but not for the reason you think. When Bonhoeffer wrote that against stupidity, we are defenseless, he wasn't being dramatic. He was describing a psychological shutdown, a moment when independent reasoning is replaced by ideological automation. Modern neuroscience now explains what he witnessed. When someone's core beliefs are challenged, especially beliefs tied to identity, the brain does not process that challenge as neutral information. It processes it as a threat. Functional MRI studies show that when political or moral beliefs are confronted, the amygdala activates the same region involved in fear responses. At the same time, activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for rational analysis, decreases. Translation: the brain shifts from thinking mode to defense mode. You can't debate someone whose nervous system thinks it's under attack. This is why arguments escalate emotionally instead of logically. The goal of the brain in that moment is not truth. It is protection. Protection of identity. Protection of belonging. Protection of psychological coherence. Bonhoeffer observed that once people surrendered their independence to a powerful movement, they stopped evaluating information autonomously. They repeated slogans. They filtered reality through pre-installed narratives. Today, we would call this cognitive capture. When a belief system becomes totalizing meaning, it explains everything and leaves no room for contradiction. It creates what psychologists call a closed epistemic system. Information that aligns is accepted. Information that challenges is rejected before analysis. And here's where it becomes dangerous. The more someone sacrifices to belong to a system, reputation, relationships, public declarations, the more expensive it becomes to admit doubt. This is known as escalation of commitment. The brain rationalizes deeper investment rather than retreating. That's why when you expose a contradiction, they don't soften. They harden. It's not stubbornness in the traditional sense. It's structural fragility. If one pillar collapses, the entire belief system might collapse. So the mind fortifies. This explains something many independent thinkers experience. You present evidence calmly. You outline context. You even acknowledge complexity. And the response you get is not curiosity, it's hostility. Because understanding would require cognitive restructuring. And cognitive restructuring is painful. It creates disorientation. It destabilizes identity. It threatens group status. So the brain chooses something easier: dismissal. Bonhoeffer wrote that the stupid person is often stubborn, but not independent. That distinction matters. Stubbornness looks strong. It feels decisive. But independence requires self-authorship, the ability to examine and revise your own framework. Stubbornness is rigidity. Independence is flexibility. And flexibility requires security. If someone's identity is fused to a belief, flexibility feels like self-erasure. There's another layer that makes this worse in modern culture: group amplification. Psychologists studying crowd behavior have long noted that individuals think differently in groups than alone. This phenomenon, de-individuation, reduces personal accountability and increases conformity. When surrounded by others who share the same belief, dissent feels dangerous. Agreement feels safe. Certainty feels reinforced. Add digital echo chambers to that, and the effect intensifies. Online spaces algorithmically curate content that confirms prior beliefs. This creates the illusion that everyone agrees. Dissent becomes rare. Complexity disappears. When you step into that space with nuance, you don't just present an alternative viewpoint. You disrupt a shared emotional atmosphere. And atmospheres resist disruption. Bonhoeffer observed that stupidity was less a psychological issue and more a sociological one. He saw that large movements infect people with intellectual surrender. He understood something critical: the power of the movement depends on the surrender of the individual. Modern research supports this. Studies on authoritarianism show that individuals with high need for cognitive closure, a preference for certainty over ambiguity, are more likely to align strongly with rigid ideological systems. Certainty reduces anxiety. Ambiguity increases it. Independent thinkers tolerate ambiguity longer. They can hold unresolved tension. They can sit with, "I don't know yet." But that tolerance is rare and socially unrewarded. Another reason arguments fail is because persuasion assumes symmetrical goals. You assume the goal is truth. They may assume the goal is dominance validation or loyalty signaling. In ideological environments, public disagreement can signal betrayal. So doubling down becomes a demonstration of allegiance. This is why debates often feel theatrical. They are not about exploration. They are about reaffirming identity. Bonhoeffer warned that once someone becomes a mindless tool, they may be capable of harm while feeling righteous. That's because moral certainty eliminates doubt, and doubt is the friction that slows harmful action. When someone is absolutely certain they are right, they no longer feel the need to question consequences. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. It was not low intelligence that fueled atrocities. It was conformity fused with certainty, which leads to the uncomfortable realization: you cannot reason someone out of a belief they did not reason themselves into. Emotional, social, and identity forces shaped it, so facts alone cannot dismantle it. Bonhoeffer concluded that only an act of liberation, not instruction, can overcome stupidity. In other words, the environment must change. The power structure must weaken. The social reinforcement must dissolve. The cost of independence must decrease. Until then, persuasion often fails. So, what does this mean for you? First, stop measuring your clarity by others' reactions. If someone reacts defensively, that doesn't automatically invalidate your reasoning. It may indicate identity friction. Second, recognize when conversation becomes counterproductive. Debating a captured mind often strengthens its walls. Third, protect your own independence. Because the pull toward surrender is universal. Every movement offers belonging. Every ideology offers certainty. Every tribe offers validation. The cost is autonomy, and autonomy feels lonely at times. Which brings us to the deeper question. If surrender is so psychologically attractive, why would anyone resist it? If independent thinking is so valuable, why does it feel so isolating? Why does clarity sometimes come with loneliness? Here's the uncomfortable truth: independence is expensive. Not financially, not intellectually, emotionally. Bonhoeffer understood something that modern psychology confirms: humans are wired for belonging before truth. From an evolutionary perspective, being wrong inside a group was safer than being right alone. For most of human history, isolation meant death, so your nervous system still carries that wiring. When you question the group, your body reacts before your intellect does. A subtle tension in your chest, a spike of anxiety when you speak up, a hesitation before expressing doubt. That's not weakness, that's biology. Neuroscientists have found that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex. Your brain interprets exclusion as injury. So when you resist ideological surrender, you're not just choosing independent thought. You're choosing to tolerate social friction, and that friction accumulates. This is why people who think independently often report feeling out of place, not superior, not enlightened, just out of alignment with the emotional rhythm of the crowd. You notice nuance where others see simplicity. You see gray where others see black and white. You hesitate where others chant. And in a culture addicted to certainty, hesitation looks like weakness. But hesitation is often cognitive integrity. Bonhoeffer described stupidity as surrendering inner independence under overwhelming external power. What he didn't romanticize was how uncomfortable resistance feels. Independent thought means sitting with doubt longer than most people can tolerate. Psychologists call this ambiguity tolerance, the ability to endure uncertainty without rushing toward premature closure. Studies show that individuals high in ambiguity tolerance are less likely to adopt extreme positions and more likely to revise their beliefs when presented with new evidence. But here's the paradox. Ambiguity tolerance correlates with higher anxiety in unstable environments because you see complexity, you see risk, you see unresolved contradictions. You can't anesthetize yourself with oversimplified narratives, and that's exhausting. Meanwhile, ideological surrender provides relief. Certainty reduces cognitive load. Group belonging reduces social threat. Clear enemies simplify moral landscapes. It feels clean. Independent thinking feels messy. That's why surrender spreads faster. There's also a status dynamic at play. In polarized environments, loud certainty often earns attention. Algorithms amplify outrage. Social groups reward alignment. Independent thinkers who refuse to chant often get ignored. And humans are deeply sensitive to social visibility. So the temptation creeps in. Wouldn't it be easier to just agree? To nod? To repeat the slogan? Of course it would. That's why Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't abstract. It was personal. He watched intelligent individuals, colleagues, professors, leaders gradually trade independence for belonging. Not because they were stupid, because the psychological cost of independence rose too high, which leads to something rarely discussed: Intellectual independence requires emotional resilience. You must withstand discomfort. You must withstand misunderstanding. You must withstand being temporarily alone. And loneliness is powerful. Modern loneliness research shows that chronic social isolation increases stress hormones, weakens immune response, and impairs cognitive performance. So when you resist group conformity, you're not just making a philosophical choice. You're navigating biological pressure. This is why independent thinkers often seek smaller, deeper communities rather than large ideological tribes. Selective connection replaces mass belonging, but that requires patience. Another overlooked factor is identity diffusion. When people fuse their identity with an ideology, they experience psychological coherence. The ideology answers who they are. Independent thinkers don't outsource identity so easily. They build it piece by piece, through reflection, through revision, through experience. That's slower, but stronger. Bonhoeffer wrote that stupidity makes people capable of evil while believing they are righteous. Independent thinkers often carry a different burden doubt about their own righteousness, and doubt feels uncomfortable. But doubt is protective. It slows certainty. It questions impulse. It creates space for recalibration. Without doubt, power goes unchecked. Without doubt, ideologies harden. Without doubt, harm accelerates. So while independence feels isolating, it also acts as a safeguard. There's another cost, though. When you repeatedly notice logical fallacies, manipulative narratives, or emotional contagion, you can become cynical. Cynicism is the shadow side of clarity. You start to withdraw. You stop engaging. You assume futility. But Bonhoeffer did not advocate withdrawal. He resisted actively at great personal risk, which means independence isn't about detachment. It's about conscious participation. The goal isn't to become socially isolated. It's to remain internally sovereign while still engaging externally. That balance is delicate. Too much isolation, and you lose empathy. Too much conformity, and you lose autonomy. Independent thinkers must cultivate something rare relational courage. The courage to engage without surrendering. The courage to disagree without dehumanizing. The courage to admit uncertainty publicly. This is why clarity often feels quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't trend. It doesn't perform. It thinks. And thinking takes time. In an environment that rewards immediacy, taking time can look like weakness, but it's strength disguised as patience. So if you've ever felt like thinking independently has made your world smaller, here's the reframing. It didn't make your world smaller. It filtered it. Surface-level alignment may decrease. Depth-level alignment increases. You lose noise. You gain signal. And that trade is subtle but profound. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for resisting ideological capture, but his theory wasn't about heroism. It was about vigilance, because surrender is always available. Every era has its slogans. Every culture has its dominant narratives. Every generation faces pressure to simplify. The question is not whether you are intelligent. The question is whether you're willing to endure the discomfort required to stay independent. And that leads us to the final part. How do you protect your mind in an age engineered to capture it? If surrender is easier, louder, and socially rewarded? How do you stay free without becoming isolated, bitter, or exhausted? Because here's the reality Bonhoeffer understood, and what modern psychology now confirms. The pressure to surrender your independence never disappears. It just changes shape. It used to come from regimes and propaganda machines. Now it comes from algorithms, tribes, outrage cycles, and ideological branding. The mechanism is the same. Offer belonging. Offer certainty. Demand loyalty. So how do you resist that without becoming emotionally detached from the world? First, you need to understand something crucial. Independence is not about contrarianism. It's not about disagreeing with everything. It's not about rejecting authority automatically. It's not about intellectual superiority. True independence is the ability to evaluate without surrendering, That requires 3 psychological disciplines. 1. Guard your cognitive autonomy. Your attention is the gateway to your mind. Modern platforms are built on something called variable reward reinforcement, the same mechanism used in slot machines. You don't know when the next emotionally stimulating piece of content will appear, so you keep scrolling. Over time, this trains your brain to crave emotional spikes instead of sustained reasoning. Emotional spikes reduce critical processing. That's not a metaphor, it's neurological. When emotionally charged content appears, the amygdala activates. Stress hormones rise. The prefrontal cortex responsible for nuanced thinking partially disengages. If you live in a constant state of micro-outrage, you slowly erode your capacity for independent analysis. So cognitive autonomy starts with attention discipline. Limit exposure to outrage-driven content. Delay immediate reactions. Refuse to let headlines dictate emotional states. Bonhoeffer warned about rising powers infecting minds. Today, the rising power is algorithmic amplification. You cannot think clearly if your nervous system is constantly stimulated. Silence is not laziness. It's mental recalibration. 2. Practice deliberate doubt, including about yourself. One of the defining traits of surrendered minds is absolute certainty. They do not question their conclusions. They defend them reflexively. Independent thinkers must cultivate the opposite habit, structured self-questioning. Ask, what evidence would change my mind? Am I emotionally invested in this belief? Would I hold this opinion if my group disagreed? Is my reaction proportional to the information? Psychologists call this metacognition, thinking about your thinking. Research consistently shows that individuals who engage in metacognitive reflection are less susceptible to misinformation and ideological rigidity. But here's the part people don't like. Metacognition is uncomfortable. It requires admitting you might be wrong. It requires pausing when you feel certain. It requires tolerating internal friction. Certainty feels powerful. Doubt feels destabilizing. But doubt protects independence. Bonhoeffer wrote that stupidity is surrender of inner autonomy. Inner autonomy requires ongoing recalibration. If you never revise, you're not independent. You're rigid. 3. Separate identity from ideology. This may be the hardest discipline of all. When identity fuses with ideology, disagreement becomes existential. If I am my belief, then challenging the belief challenges me. That's when defensiveness replaces dialogue. To remain independent, you must decouple who you are from what you currently believe. Beliefs can evolve. Identity should be deeper than ideology. Your identity can be rooted in values, curiosity, integrity, humility, courage. Values endure across belief shifts. Ideologies do not. Bonhoeffer's warning was not about one political movement. It was about a human vulnerability. Under pressure, humans trade independence for comfort. So the goal is not to eliminate belonging. Belonging is necessary. The goal is to belong without surrendering. Belong in relationships that tolerate disagreement. Belong in communities that encourage questioning. Belong in spaces where doubt isn't punished. That's the difference between healthy community and ideological capture. The loneliness reframed. Earlier, we talked about the isolation that can accompany independent thought, but let's reframe it. It's not loneliness in the traditional sense. It's selective alignment. You may not resonate with large-scale movements, but you will resonate deeply with individuals who value clarity over certainty. Depth replaces volume, and depth sustains. Bonhoeffer himself was not isolated intellectually. He had co-conspirators. He had close friends. Independence does not mean standing alone in every room. It means refusing to surrender your internal compass. The final warning and the final hope. Bonhoeffer was executed weeks before liberation. He never saw the regime collapse. But his analysis endured because it wasn't tied to one era. It described a repeating pattern of human psychology. Whenever certainty becomes currency, whenever belonging demands silence, Whenever power rises by simplifying complexity, the risk of intellectual surrender rises with it. But here's what often gets missed. The capacity for surrender is universal. No one is immune. That includes you. That includes me. Independence is not a fixed trait. It's a daily practice. You must protect it intentionally, because the pull toward certainty will always feel easier. The crowd will always feel louder. The slogans will always feel simpler. But freedom, real cognitive freedom, is quieter. It's slower. It's less rewarded publicly. But it's stable. Bonhoeffer ended with a line that still echoes. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Stripped of theology, what he meant was humility before truth. Wisdom begins where arrogance ends. It begins when you admit, I could be wrong. I need to examine. I will not surrender my thinking. In an age addicted to outrage, where algorithms reward emotional combustion, where ideologies compete for allegiance, the most radical act may simply be this: pause, think, question, refuse to chant. Not because you are smarter, but because you are unwilling to surrender. And in a world that rewards surrender, that quiet refusal is power.